Hi everyone, I'm Jessica. I'm an embryologist and the creator of Explaining IVF on Instagram. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the IVF funnel, which is a way of explaining how many eggs would make it to the blastocyst or the embryo stage during an average IVF cycle. A lot of people think that because you have a certain number of eggs retrieved during an IVF cycle, you'll have that many embryos that are available for transfer. Unfortunately, that's not the case because there are a lot of steps that have to occur from the time an egg is retrieved until the time that an embryo is transferred. And during each of these stages, there are average drop-off rates, meaning that some eggs might not fertilize or develop properly. I'm going to walk you through each of the stages of an IVF cycle, and then we'll talk about some of those drop-off rates during each one of those stages. The first stage is what we call stimulation and the egg retrieval procedure. Before the egg retrieval procedure, a woman will administer medications that help the follicles inside of her ovaries grow. Inside of those follicles should be eggs, and the hope is that as those follicles are developing due to the medications, the eggs inside of them are also developing as well. Even though we have a specific number of follicles that might be growing, it doesn't always mean that that's the number of eggs that will be retrieved. For example, your doctor might see 20 follicles on an ultrasound, but you might only have 18 that are retrieved, and that's perfectly normal. Some follicles are just considered empty. It could be because ovulation occurred, or the follicles ruptured, or the eggs inside of those follicles didn't survive for any reason, or it could be from an abnormal response to medications. So what we were looking for are eggs that are called M2 or mature oocytes, but not every egg that is retrieved will be a mature oocyte. On average, we expect about 70 to 80% of the eggs that are retrieved to be mature, meaning that they're developed enough to be able to be fertilized by a sperm after insemination. The first stage is called the egg retrieval procedure. At this point, we can expect about 70 to 80% of the eggs that are retrieved to be mature, meaning that they're able to be fertilized by a sperm. Stage 2 is insemination. This is where an egg is introduced to a sperm. At this point, we expect about 50 to 80% of the eggs that are inseminated to fertilize properly. There are two primary ways to inseminate eggs inside the IVF lab. The first is called conventional insemination, where eggs and sperm are placed into a drop of media or fluid overnight in the hopes that the sperm will fertilize the egg, similar to what would happen inside the fallopian tube in the body. For conventional insemination, we expect about 50% fertilization on average. The other type of insemination is called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. This is when one sperm is injected directly into each mature egg in hopes that fertilization will occur. With ICSI, we expect about 50 to 80% of the eggs to fertilize properly. Which is better, conventional insemination or ICSI? The answer to this is really, it's up to you and your doctor to decide. While ICSI does tend to provide higher fertilization rates versus conventional insemination, recent guidelines have said that if there's no male factor infertility or a history of poor fertilization with conventional insemination, then conventional insemination should give you the same results as ICSI. It's something that I recommend people talk with their doctors about to decide which option is best for them. But when there are cases of male factor infertility, ICSI is always recommended. Why do some eggs not fertilize? Sometimes even whenever you do ICSI, when you can guarantee that one sperm enters into an egg, it's still not guaranteed that fertilization will occur. The reason for this is because there are a lot of steps that are involved once the sperm actually enters the egg for fertilization to occur. And errors at any of these stages can actually cause fertilization to not occur properly. Some common reasons for this might be egg quality issues or sperm quality issues. It could be something that happens inside of the egg after the sperm enters that allows fertilization to not occur properly, meaning one of those steps is not occurring the way that it's supposed to. Or with conventional insemination, it's possible that a sperm never even enters the egg. Alternatively, it's possible for multiple sperm to enter an egg, and this causes polyspermy, in which case the embryo would have an extra set of DNA. Stage 3 is embryo development. This refers to how many fertilized eggs develop into blastocysts. All eggs begin as a single cell, a fertilized egg or a zygote. This is what we look for on day 1 in the lab, so the day after insemination occurs is called day 1 in the lab. Over the next few days, that single cell will undergo cell division called mitosis, where it replicates its DNA and divides into 2 identical cells. Those 2 cells will then divide into 4 cells, and so on. On day 3 of development, we hope to see at least 6 cells inside of the embryo, but we hope to see around 8 to 10. That's more ideal. And then by day 5, we're hoping to see over 100 cells in the embryo. And at this point, we also hope that the embryo enters the blastocyst stage of development. This means that it has 2 distinct cell lines in it, and it has a cavity as well. And that means that it's following a normal rate of development. On average, we expect about 30 to 50% of fertilized eggs to develop into blastocysts. However, they don't always develop by day 5. In some labs, they're given an extra day or 2 to develop, so some might develop on day 6 or day 7. But on average, we expect about 30 to 50% of those fertilized eggs to develop into blastocysts by the end of the IVF cycle. Stage 4 is pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT. This is something that's optional, so not everyone chooses to do it, but what happens is a few cells are taken from an embryo and they're sent for genetic testing to determine whether or not those cells within the embryo have the right number of chromosomes or the right amount of DNA. Depending on how many cells within that sample have the right amount of chromosomes, the embryo will be deemed either euploid, which means genetically normal, aneuploid, which means genetically abnormal, or mosaic, which means it's a mixture of both normal and abnormal cells. The primary factor when determining how many embryos we expect to be euploid is the woman's age at the time that the eggs are retrieved. If a woman is between 30 and 35 years old when she has her eggs retrieved, we expect about 60% of her embryos that are created to be genetically normal. This declines to about 40% by the time a woman is 40 years old when she has her eggs retrieved. If a woman has her eggs retrieved at 35 years of age, we expect that in 85% of these IVF cycles, at least one embryo will be genetically normal. By age 40, we expect in about 75% of IVF cycles that there will be one genetically normal embryo created. Stage 5 is the embryo transfer. At this point, the embryo is transferred from the IVF lab into the uterus of either the mother or the gestational carrier. There are a lot of factors that can affect the success of an embryo transfer. The most common would be the embryo's grade, whether or not the embryo is genetically normal, as well as the uterine environment. So if there are any abnormalities such as polyps or fibroids inside of the uterus, this could affect implantation and embryo development. The younger that a woman is, the higher the chance of a clinical pregnancy, meaning the pregnancy is detected on an ultrasound, and higher the live birth rate, meaning that at least one live birth occurs from the embryo transfer. For women who are under 35 years of age, we can expect about a 61% clinical pregnancy rate and about a 52% live birth rate. At 38 to 40 years of age, we expect a clinical pregnancy rate of about 52.6% and a live birth rate of 45.7%. This is for the first embryo transfer, whether it's fresh or frozen, and this data comes from the 2022 SART National Summary. For women who are under 35 years of age during their egg retrieval and who are undergoing their second embryo transfer, there's a 56% clinical pregnancy rate, and there's a 45.7% live birth rate. For women who are 38 to 40 years old, we have a 51.4% clinical pregnancy rate and a 40.3% live birth rate. If a woman is under 35 years old, we expect about 49% of the embryo transfers to result in a live birth. For women who are 38 to 40 at the time of the egg retrieval, we expect about 40% of the embryo transfers to result in a live birth. First, let's look at the live birth rates for women who are doing their first embryo transfer following an egg retrieval. For women who are under 35 at the time of retrieval, we expect 51.9% of the embryo transfers to result in at least one live birth. For women who are 35 to 37 years old, we expect 48.2% of transfers to result in at least one live birth. For women who are 38 to 40 at the time of retrieval, we expect 42.3% of their transfers to result in a live birth. For women who are 41 to 42 at the time of retrieval, we expect 32.3% of their first transfers to result in at least one live birth. And for women who are over 42, we expect 15.7% of their first transfers to result in at least one live birth. So if the first transfer is unsuccessful and a woman has to undergo another embryo transfer using embryos created from that IVF cycle, we can also talk about those live birth rates. So for women who are under 35, we expect 45.7% of second embryo transfers to result in at least one live birth. For women who are 35 to 37, we expect 43.5% of the second transfers to result in at least one live birth. For women who are 38 to 40, we expect 40.3% of those their second transfers to result in at least one live birth. For women who are 41 to 42, we expect 36.6% of their second transfers to result in at least one live birth. And for women who are over 42, we expect 25.2% of their second transfers to result in at least one live birth. Let's look at an example of the IVF funnel using someone who has 10 eggs retrieved. So if you have 10 eggs retrieved and we expect about 70 to 80% of them to be mature, we'll say that 8 of those eggs were mature. So they're able to be inseminated and have the potential for fertilization. Of those 8 that are inseminated, we expect anywhere from 50 to 80% of them to fertilize properly. So for example, we can say that we have 6 embryos that fertilized properly of the 8 that were inseminated. From there, we expect about 30 to 50% of those fertilized eggs to develop properly. So if we started out with 6 eggs that fertilized properly, we can say that we expect maybe 3 embryos to develop properly. If those embryos are sent for genetic testing, then the percent that we would expect to be genetically normal or euploid would depend primarily on the woman's age. So women who are 35 and under, we expect a higher number of euploid embryos versus women who are over 35. For example, we could say that we could expect anywhere from 1 to 2 genetically normal embryos that would be deemed suitable for transfer. The Center for Disease Control, or CDC, also published data in 2021 that showed what percentage of embryo transfers were successful based on the woman's age at the time of retrieval. They found that when women were under 35 years old at the time of retrieval, that 49.1% of the embryo transfers resulted in a live birth. For women who were 35 to 37 years old at the time of retrieval, they found 44.8% of embryo transfers resulted in a live birth. For women who were 38 to 40 at the time of retrieval, they found 40.2% of embryo transfers resulted in a live birth. And for women who were 40 or older at the time of retrieval, they found that 24.4% of embryo transfers resulted in a live birth. It's always good to maintain a healthy diet and drink plenty of water and to do light exercise. However, these aren't things that are going to make or break your transfer. The most important thing that you can do is just make sure that you're taking your medications as prescribed and you're going to your monitoring appointments. This makes sure that the uterine environment looks suitable for implantation prior to your embryo transfer. The most important is making sure that your uterus is optimal for implantation and development. There are some things that your doctor might recommend prior to your transfer, which might include a hysteroscopy or a saline sonogram or some other kind of diagnostic imaging. And what these do is they look inside of the uterus to make sure that the environment is suitable for implantation. For example, they want to make sure that there are no polyps or fibroids or scar tissue that could interfere with implantation and embryo development. I hope that you found this information about the IVF funnel useful. If you have any questions or you want more information, you can always visit the Dandy Fertility page, and you can also follow them on Instagram. And if you'd like to follow me on Instagram as well, my handle is Explaining IVF.